And when we begin to understand how deeply emotion shapes biology, we are forced to face something uncomfortable. What we refuse to feel does not disappear, it waits. I've spent years studying the relationship between belief, consciousness, and the body, and one pattern appears again and again. The emotions we suppress do not dissolve with time. They embed themselves into our nervous system, our chemistry, and eventually into the very tissues of our body. Not as punishment, not as fate, but as unresolved energy-seeking expression. Ancient traditions understood this long before modern laboratories existed. They taught that the heart is not only a pump, but a center of intelligence. Today, modern science confirms that the heart communicates continuously with the brain through electrical and biochemical signals. When we experience fear, grief, resentment, or shame and do not process them, those signals shift into incoherent patterns. And incoherence over time becomes stress. Chronic stress becomes inflammation. Inflammation becomes the breeding ground for disease. But the deeper issue is not simply biological. It is conscious. Unresolved emotion alters perception. It changes the way we interpret reality. When someone carries unhealed betrayal, they begin to expect betrayal. When someone carries unresolved abandonment, they unconsciously anticipate loss. And here is where belief enters the equation. Belief is not just an idea in the mind, it is a biological instruction. What we believe shapes the chemistry of our body. If I believe the world is unsafe, my body produces stress hormones as though danger is always near. If I believe I am unworthy, my nervous system operates in subtle self-protection, even when nothing is threatening me. This is the dark side of unresolved emotion. It becomes identity. We begin to say, this is just who I am. But often who we think we are is simply a collection of unprocessed emotional experiences. And because the subconscious mind operates automatically, we recreate the same patterns again and again, reinforcing the belief that the world confirms our pain. I want to be very clear. Feeling emotion is not weakness. In fact, it is one of the most powerful capacities of human consciousness. Emotion is energy in motion. It is meant to move. When it moves, it informs us. When it is suppressed, it transforms into something heavier. Modern neuroscience shows us that traumatic or intense emotional experiences are encoded not only in memory, but in sensory networks of the brain. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. This is why a smell, a tone of voice, or a facial expression can trigger a reaction that feels disproportionate to the present moment. The reaction is not about now, it is about then. Ancient wisdom traditions spoke of this as stored energy within the body. They encouraged practices of breath, prayer, meditation, and forgiveness, not as ritual alone, but as biological recalibration. When we breathe deeply and intentionally, we signal safety to the nervous system. When we practice compassion, we shift heart rhythms toward coherence. When we forgive, we free ourselves from continuous stress chemistry. Forgiveness, in this context, is not approval. It is liberation from the biological cost of resentment. Unresolved anger, for example, keeps the body in a low-grade fight response. The muscles remain subtly contracted, the breath becomes shallow. The immune system diverts resources toward defense rather than repair. Over time, this becomes exhaustion. Many people believe they are simply tired because of workload or age. Often they are tired because their body has been fighting a battle that ended years ago. Belief amplifies this process. If I believe that holding on to anger protects me, I will unconsciously resist letting it go. If I believe vulnerability is dangerous, I will suppress grief. And suppression does not eliminate emotion, it buries it alive. The mind-body connection is not poetic language, it is measurable. Hormones shift within seconds of emotional change. Heart rhythms synchronize or fragment depending on internal states. Gene expression can be influenced by long-term emotional patterns. What we feel consistently becomes what our cells expect. Here is where consciousness becomes the turning point. We are not victims of our emotional history. We are participants in its integration. The first step is awareness, not analysis, not judgment, but awareness. When I notice irritation rising, instead of reacting outwardly, I can turn inward and ask, what is this really connected to? Often, the surface emotion is a doorway to something older. This requires courage, because unresolved emotion carries memory, and memory carries sensation. When we begin to feel what we once avoided, the body may tremble, the breath may tighten, the chest may ache, but this is not regression, it is release. There is a profound difference between reliving and releasing. Reliving keeps us trapped in the story. Releasing allows the energy to move through without reinforcing the narrative. One of the most powerful shifts I have witnessed in people is when they recognize that their belief about themselves was formed in a moment of pain, not truth. A child who experiences rejection may conclude, "I am not enough." That belief then shapes decades of behavior. The body responds as though proving worth is necessary for survival. Stress becomes normalized. Achievement becomes addiction. Rest feels unsafe. And yet, when that belief is examined gently, compassionately, its foundation begins to dissolve. The biology follows. Ancient teachings remind us that the heart has its own wisdom. Modern research suggests that when heart rhythms become coherent, brain function improves, emotional regulation stabilizes, and clarity increases. This coherence is not achieved by forcing positivity. It is cultivated through authentic alignment, feeling what is real while choosing a new interpretation. Choosing a new interpretation does not deny pain, it reframes it. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" we begin to ask, "What is this teaching me about my capacity to grow?" In this way, unresolved emotion becomes a doorway rather than a prison. But here is the shadow many people avoid. If we do not consciously process our emotions, they do not remain personal. They influence our relationships, they shape our communication, they even affect the collective field of human interaction. When large numbers of people carry fear, society becomes reactive. When resentment is widespread, division intensifies. Human consciousness is interconnected. The coherence or incoherence within one nervous system subtly influences others. This is why healing is not selfish, it is contribution. I often reflect on how many conflicts, both personal and global, are fueled not by present reality, but by accumulated emotional residue. When we are triggered, we believe we are responding to now, but often we are responding to layers of unprocessed experience stored within us. The dark side of unresolved emotion is not that it makes us bad, it makes us unconscious. An unconscious emotion, when combined with powerful belief, becomes destiny, unless we pause long enough to notice the pattern forming beneath the surface of our reactions, beneath the language we use about ourselves, beneath the stories we repeat without realizing that each repetition strengthens the neurological pathways that keep us bound to an identity shaped by pain rather than possibility. And when we finally slow down enough to observe that mechanism operating in real time, we begin to sense that something within us has always been larger than the wound itself. Something steady, something aware, something capable of choosing differently. And that awareness is where the transformation truly begins. And when that awareness stabilizes, even briefly, we start to recognize that we are not our reactions, we are the space in which those reactions arise. This is where the real work begins. Most people attempt to change behavior without addressing the emotional architecture beneath it. We try to think differently, speak differently, act differently, but if the emotional charge remains unresolved, it quietly overrides our intentions. The body will always follow the strongest signal, and unresolved emotion is a powerful signal. I've observed that when we suppress emotion, we fragment internally. One part of us feels the pain, another part judges the pain, a third part tries to control it. This inner division creates physiological stress. The nervous system thrives on coherence. When thought, emotion, and belief are aligned, fragmentation creates internal conflict, and internal conflict drains life force. Ancient teachings often describe this as a loss of wholeness. Modern science describes it as dysregulation. Different language, same insight. Consider what happens when someone carries unresolved grief. They may smile outwardly, perform their responsibilities, maintain social roles, yet internally there is a muted heaviness. Over time, the body adapts to that heaviness as a baseline. Breathing becomes subtly restricted. Posture collapses slightly. Hormonal rhythms adjust around low-level sadness. The person forgets what emotional vitality feels like. This is not dramatic trauma, this is quiet accumulation. And here is where belief becomes critical again. If I believe that expressing grief makes me weak, I will resist allowing it to move. If I believe that anger is unacceptable, I will turn it inward. When anger turns inward, it often becomes self-criticism. Self-criticism sustained over years becomes shame. Shame is one of the most biologically destabilizing emotional states a human can experience. Shame collapses posture, it reduces eye contact, it constricts breath, it lowers immune resilience, and perhaps most damaging, it distorts identity. Instead of "I made a mistake," shame whispers, "I am a mistake." That belief programs biology. We cannot separate consciousness from chemistry. Every repeated thought strengthens neural circuits. Every repeated emotional state reinforces hormonal patterns. The body becomes efficient at what we practice. If we practice resentment, the body becomes efficient at resentment. If we practice compassion, the body becomes efficient at compassion. This means unresolved emotion is not static. It compounds. Many people ask why certain patterns repeat in their lives, similar relationships, similar conflicts, similar disappointments. From a consciousness perspective, unresolved emotion acts like a magnet. It filters perception and influences choices before we are aware we are choosing. We gravitate towards circumstances that resonate with the emotional frequency we carry. This is not mystical exaggeration. It is pattern recognition operating below conscious awareness. If I carry unresolved abandonment, I may unconsciously select partners who are emotionally unavailable. When they distance themselves, the old wound is triggered. The nervous system responds as though the original event is happening again. Stress hormones flood the body. The belief "I am not worth staying for" is reinforced. The cycle continues until awareness interrupts it. Interrupting the cycle does not mean suppressing reaction. It means witnessing it. When the familiar surge of fear or anger arises, instead of projecting outward, we pause. We feel the sensation in the body. We breathe into it. We allow it to move without attaching it to a story. This is uncomfortable at first because the body is accustomed to discharge through blame, withdrawal, or control. But when we stay present with the sensation, something remarkable happens. The energy begins to dissipate. The nervous system recalibrates. The old memory loses intensity. With repetition, the emotional charge weakens. The belief attached to it becomes less convincing. This is emotional integration. Integration is different from suppression. Suppression pushes emotion into shadow. Integration brings it into conscious relationship. We acknowledge its origin, we honor its protective intention, then we update the system with new information. I am safe now. I am capable now. I am not that child anymore. The body listens. Research in psychoneuroimmunology shows that emotional states influence immune function. Chronic hostility correlates with inflammatory markers. Sustained loneliness affects cardiovascular health. Conversely, feelings of connection and gratitude improve heart rate variability and resilience. The body is not indifferent to our inner world. This brings us to responsibility, not blame, but responsibility. If unresolved emotion shapes biology, perception, and behavior, then tending to our emotional life is not optional self-help. It is foundational human hygiene. We brush our teeth daily, we exercise our muscles, yet many of us ignore the emotional residue accumulating in our nervous system. Why? Because feeling deeply requires vulnerability, and vulnerability challenges the beliefs we formed to survive. Some of us learned early that love was conditional. Others learned that safety depended on silence. Others learned that strength meant emotional numbness. Those beliefs once protected us, but what protects a child may imprison an adult. The dark side of unresolved emotion is not simply illness or conflict, it is stagnation. It keeps consciousness looping within outdated survival strategies. Growth demands that we outgrow the beliefs formed in pain. This does not mean abandoning faith or tradition. In fact, many spiritual paths emphasize purification of the heart. Across cultures, the idea appears that inner clarity precedes outer harmony. When the heart is burdened with resentment, envy, or unprocessed sorrow, perception narrows. When the heart is clear, perception expands. And I want to emphasize something important. This exploration is fully respectful and does not criticize Islam or any religion. Every tradition carries wisdom about compassion, forgiveness, and self-examination. The science we are discussing simply offers language that complements those timeless teachings. When we combine ancient wisdom with modern research, a unified picture emerges. Human beings are self-regulating systems designed for coherence. Emotion is feedback. Belief is instruction. Consciousness is the field in which both operate. So what happens when we ignore the feedback? The system compensates. Compensation eventually becomes dysfunction. The body may express what the mind refuses to acknowledge: tension, headaches, digestive disruption, fatigue without clear cause. These are not always purely physical malfunctions. Sometimes they are signals, invitations to look inward. I am not suggesting that all illness is emotional. That would be simplistic and unkind. But I am suggesting that emotional health is inseparable from physical health. When we tend to one, we influence the other. Perhaps the most transformative realization is this: we do not need to eliminate emotion. We need to allow it to complete its cycle. Emotions are waves. When permitted to rise and fall naturally, they leave clarity behind. When resisted, they freeze into patterns. And if we begin, even gently, to sit with the sensations we once avoided, if we question the beliefs that formed in our most vulnerable moments, if we choose to respond rather than react, we start to feel a subtle shift in our internal landscape. A quiet spaciousness where contraction once lived, a steadiness that does not depend on controlling others. And in that steadiness, we discover that what we once called weakness was actually untapped strength, waiting for conscious recognition, and that strength invites us into a deeper inquiry about how much of our current identity is authentic and how much is simply inherited emotion still asking to be felt. And that question alone can begin to unravel decades of unconscious conditioning. When we ask ourselves whether our reactions are truly ours or echoes of unresolved emotion, we step into a different level of maturity. We move from survival consciousness into reflective consciousness. Survival reacts, reflection observes. I often remind people that awareness is not passive, it is transformative. The moment we observe a pattern without judgment, we interrupt its automatic momentum. That interruption creates space, and in that space, choice becomes possible. Unresolved emotion thrives in unconscious repetition. It feeds on predictability. If I always respond to criticism with defensiveness, that pathway strengthens. If I always respond to disappointment with withdrawal, that pathway becomes efficient. The nervous system favors efficiency. It does not ask whether the pattern serves us, it simply reinforces what is practiced. So when we consciously choose a different response, even once we introduce new data into the system, the first time we pause instead of react, the body may resist. There may be a surge of anxiety or urgency. That is simply the old program attempting to maintain control. But if we remain steady, breathing deeply, feeling the sensations without attaching them to a story, we begin to teach the nervous system that safety does not require old defenses. Over time, this retraining changes biology. Neuroplasticity allows new circuits to form. Hormonal responses recalibrate. Heart rhythms become more coherent. The body begins to trust the present moment rather than react to the past. One of the most profound shifts I've witnessed in this process is the movement from blame to ownership. Blame externalizes unresolved emotion. Ownership internalizes growth. When we blame, we say, "You made me feel this way." When we take ownership, we say, "This feeling was activated within me." That subtle shift restores power. Ownership does not excuse harmful behavior from others. It simply recognizes that our internal state is ultimately ours to tend. The world may trigger us, but it does not install the trigger. The trigger was formed earlier, and if it was formed, it can be transformed. This transformation requires honesty. We must be willing to admit when our anger masks hurt, when our control masks fear, when our independence masks unresolved rejection. This is not self-criticism. It is self-inquiry. Ancient contemplative practices emphasize self-examination, not as punishment, but as purification. To purify means to clarify. When emotion is clarified, it loses distortion. When distortion fades, perception becomes more accurate. Accurate perception changes relationships. Imagine interacting with others without projecting past wounds onto present conversations. Imagine listening without preparing defense. Imagine responding from grounded awareness rather than accumulated tension. This is not idealistic fantasy. It is a byproduct of emotional integration. And here is something deeply important. Unresolved emotion does not only affect us psychologically and biologically, it influences our sense of meaning. When we carry unprocessed pain, we often construct narratives to justify it. Life is unfair. People cannot be trusted. I will always struggle. These narratives become philosophical positions, but often they are emotional conclusions disguised as truth. Belief solidifies these conclusions. If enough emotional experiences support a painful belief, it begins to feel factual. Yet belief, no matter how convincing, is still a lens, and lenses can be changed. Changing belief does not mean denying experience, it means updating interpretation. The same event can generate bitterness or wisdom depending on how it is integrated. When pain is processed consciously, it expands compassion. When pain is suppressed, it narrows perception. Compassion is one of the most powerful biological regulators available to us. When we cultivate genuine compassion for ourselves and for others, the body shifts out of defensive states. Heart rhythms synchronize, stress hormones decline, the immune system strengthens. Compassion is not sentimental. It is physiological coherence expressed through consciousness. Self-compassion especially dissolves shame. Many people are far more forgiving toward others than toward themselves. They replay past mistakes internally, reinforcing guilt and self-judgment. This continuous inner criticism keeps the nervous system activated. It is impossible to heal while constantly attacking oneself. When we replace self-condemnation with curiosity, healing accelerates. Curiosity opens. Judgment contracts. If I approach my anger with curiosity, what is this protecting? I gain insight. If I approach it with judgment, I shouldn't feel this way, I drive it deeper. What we resist persists, what we allow integrates. This principle appears across psychological research and ancient wisdom alike. Emotions complete their cycle when fully felt without resistance. The body is designed for this. Tears release stress chemicals. Deep exhalations calm the vagus nerve. Trembling discharges excess adrenaline. These are not signs of weakness. They are mechanisms of regulation. The dark side emerges only when we interrupt this natural completion. Culturally, many of us were taught to suppress visible emotion, to remain composed, to avoid discomfort. But suppression accumulates internal pressure. Eventually, that pressure seeks release, sometimes through illness, sometimes through explosive reactions, sometimes through quiet despair. Integration prevents accumulation. And integration is a practice, not a one-time event. Each day offers opportunities to notice subtle emotional shifts, irritation in traffic, disappointment in conversation, anxiety before a decision. These small moments are gateways. If we use them as training grounds for awareness, we build emotional resilience. Resilience is not the absence of emotion, it is the capacity to experience emotion without being overwhelmed by it. When resilience grows, identity softens. We no longer define ourselves by our wounds. We recognize that our past shaped us, but does not confine us. This recognition expands consciousness beyond survival narratives. At a collective level, this expansion has profound implications. A society composed of individuals who have integrated their emotions responds differently to conflict. Dialogue replaces hostility. Understanding replaces projection. Policies reflect cooperation rather than fear. Human consciousness evolves through individual responsibility. And so the inquiry returns to the personal. Where in my life am I reacting from old pain? Where am I holding on to resentment that no longer protects me? Where have I mistaken a survival belief for an absolute truth? These questions are not comfortable, but discomfort often signals growth. When we sit quietly and feel into our body, noticing tightness, heaviness, warmth, or constriction, we reconnect with the present. The body always lives in now. It is the mind that travels backward and forward. By grounding attention in sensation, we anchor consciousness in immediacy. From that grounded state, something remarkable happens. We begin to sense that beneath all emotion, beneath anger, beneath grief, beneath fear, there is a steady awareness that has never been harmed. It has witnessed every experience without being diminished by them. Touching that awareness changes everything. Because once we recognize that our deepest identity is not the wound but the witness, we begin to relate to unresolved emotion differently. It is no longer an enemy, it becomes information. And information, when understood, becomes empowerment. Yet even as this realization dawns, we may notice subtle resistance, a part of us hesitant to let go of familiar pain, because pain has been part of our story for so long, and letting it dissolve feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory where we are no longer defined by what hurt us, but by what we choose next. And that choice invites us into a new chapter of consciousness that is still unfolding. And that unfolding is not dramatic or explosive. It is subtle. It happens in the quiet decisions no one else sees. When we release identification with unresolved emotion, we do not suddenly become emotionless. We become responsive rather than reactive. There is a profound difference. Reaction is fast, automatic, and rooted in memory. Response is deliberate, conscious, and rooted in presence. Presence is the medicine. Most unresolved emotion survives because we are rarely fully present when it arises. We distract ourselves, we rationalize, we analyze instead of feel. Yet emotion does not require analysis first, it requires acknowledgement. I've found that when we allow ourselves to simply say internally, I feel this, something softens. The body registers validation. Many of us never learn to validate our own emotional experience. We learn to override it. So the simple act of recognition becomes transformative. Recognition leads to regulation. When the nervous system feels seen by our own awareness, it begins to settle. This is why mindful breathing is so powerful. Slow, rhythmic breath communicates safety. Safety allows stored emotion to surface without overwhelming us. Without safety, the system clamps down again. Unresolved emotion often hides beneath chronic busyness. If we never slow down, we never feel what is waiting. Productivity becomes avoidance. Achievement becomes anesthesia. But eventually the body demands stillness. Sometimes that stillness arrives as fatigue, sometimes as illness, sometimes as emotional breakdown. These moments, though uncomfortable, are invitations. They are not failures. They are requests from the body to be heard. When we accept the invitation, integration deepens. Integration is not about revisiting every painful memory. It is about changing our relationship to emotional energy in the present. Each time an old pattern activates and we choose awareness over reaction, we dissolve a layer of conditioning. Layers matter. Unresolved emotion accumulates in layers over years. Expecting instant liberation is unrealistic. But steady attention peels those layers gradually, and with each layer released, vitality returns. Vitality is a sign of coherence. When the heart and brain communicate in synchrony, clarity increases. Decisions feel less forced. Intuition becomes more accessible. Intuition in this context is not mystical guesswork. It is the body's integrated intelligence operating without distortion from unresolved fear. Fear, when processed, becomes discernment. Anger, when integrated, becomes boundary clarity. Grief, when honored, becomes compassion. Every emotion contains potential wisdom. The dark side appears only when that potential is blocked. Blocked emotion distorts perception of time. We may feel as though we are still living inside an old event. A comment from someone today feels as painful as a criticism from decades ago. The intensity seems disproportionate. That disproportion reveals unfinished processing. Once the emotion completes its cycle, the present moment regains proportion. Proportion restores balance. Balance does not mean constant calm, it means flexibility. We bend without breaking. We feel without drowning. We express without attacking. These capacities are not personality traits, they are skills cultivated through conscious practice. One practical approach I often share involves 3 steps. Notice, name, nurture. Notice the sensation in the body, not the story. The sensation, tightness in the chest, heat in the face, heaviness in the stomach. Name the emotion gently: anger, sadness, fear, disappointment. Naming engages the prefrontal cortex, bringing regulation online. Then nurture the experience with breath and compassion, not trying to change it immediately, simply creating space for it to move. This process rewires our relationship to emotion. Over time, emotions lose their threatening quality. They become signals rather than storms. Another important dimension is forgiveness of self for having carried unresolved emotion in the first place. Many people feel ashamed that they should be over it by now. That belief adds another layer of suffering. Healing unfolds at the pace of safety, not at the pace of expectation. Patience is biological kindness. When we allow ourselves patience, the nervous system relaxes. Relaxation facilitates integration. Pressure inhibits it. The mind often wants dramatic breakthroughs. The body prefers steady safety. When safety becomes consistent, deeper layers surface naturally. We do not have to force excavation. The system reveals what it is ready to release. Community also plays a role. Human beings regulate each other. Safe connection accelerates emotional healing. When we share vulnerably with someone who listens without judgment, our physiology shifts. Oxytocin increases, cortisol decreases, trust rebuilds, isolation dissolves. Unresolved emotion thrives in isolation, it weakens in connection. This is why collective healing matters. Families, communities, and societies benefit when individuals take responsibility for their emotional integration. Reactive individuals create reactive systems. Regulated individuals create stabilizing influence. The impact extends beyond personal well-being. Children learn emotional regulation by observing adults. If adults suppress or explode, children internalize those patterns. If adults model awareness and repair, children inherit resilience. In this way, integrating our own unresolved emotion becomes an act of generational transformation. Generational patterns often carry emotional residue that predates us. Beliefs about worth, safety, or identity may have been shaped by experiences of those who came before. When we examine these beliefs consciously, we interrupt transmission. We do not have to carry everything forward. This recognition can feel both empowering and unsettling. Empowering because it restores choice. Unsettling because it removes excuses. Once we see that healing is possible, avoidance becomes conscious. Yet avoidance, too, can be met with compassion. Parts of us resist because they learned that feeling was dangerous. Those parts deserve patience, not force. As integration deepens, something subtle shifts in how we relate to uncertainty. Previously, unresolved emotion may have amplified fear of the unknown. Now, with greater coherence, uncertainty feels less threatening. We trust our capacity to respond rather than control. Control is often a strategy to manage unresolved fear. When fear integrates, control relaxes. In that relaxation, creativity emerges. Creativity requires emotional fluidity. Rigid systems cannot innovate. The same principle applies internally. When emotion flows freely, imagination expands, possibility widens. And so the dark side of unresolved emotion slowly transforms into the light of integrated awareness. Not because pain never existed, but because pain was honored, felt, and released rather than suppressed. Yet even as we experience this expansion, life continues to present challenges. New disappointments arise. New losses occur. Integration is not immunity from difficulty. It is increased capacity to meet difficulty consciously. Each new challenge becomes an opportunity to practice, to notice, to name, to nurture, to respond rather than react. And as we continue practicing, we may begin to sense that emotional integration is not merely about personal comfort, but about aligning with a deeper intelligence within us, an intelligence that has always known how to restore balance, how to return to coherence, how to transform contraction into growth. And when we trust that intelligence enough to let it guide our inner work, we step into a relationship with ourselves that is no longer adversarial, but collaborative. And from that collaboration, a new form of strength emerges, quiet yet unwavering, inviting us to explore what becomes possible when consciousness is no longer bound by the shadows it once carried, but is free to create from clarity instead. And from that clarity, something extraordinary begins to take shape within us. When consciousness is no longer clouded by layers of unresolved emotion, perception sharpens. We begin to see reality as it is, rather than as it was filtered through old wounds. This shift is subtle but profound. It changes how we interpret a look, a tone of voice, a delay in response. What once triggered insecurity may now simply register as neutral information. Neutrality is powerful. That it is the space where we are not pulled into defensive narratives. It is the ground from which authentic choice emerges. And authenticity is the natural expression of integrated emotion. For much of our lives, we may have confused intensity with aliveness. Drama can feel energizing, conflict can feel familiar, but once unresolved emotion is processed, we discover a different kind of vitality, one rooted in steadiness rather than volatility. This steadiness does not mean we stop caring, it means we care without losing ourselves. I often reflect on how much energy is consumed maintaining emotional armor. The constant vigilance, the subtle scanning for threat, the rehearsed defenses. When that armor softens, energy returns to us. Creativity increases, sleep deepens, relationships feel less exhausting. The body thrives without armor. Physiologically, when we feel safe internally, the parasympathetic nervous system becomes more active. Digestion improves, cellular repair accelerates, inflammation decreases. These are not abstract concepts. They are measurable outcomes of emotional regulation. But beyond the measurable lies something experiential, a sense of inner spaciousness. Spaciousness allows conflicting emotions to coexist without chaos. We can feel sadness and gratitude at the same time. We can feel fear and courage simultaneously. Integration does not eliminate complexity, it increases our capacity to hold it. This capacity transforms how we navigate conflict. Instead of defending identity, we listen for understanding. Instead of proving a point, we seek clarity. The need to be right often dissolves when unresolved insecurity is healed. We no longer require external validation to stabilize our internal state. Validation from within changes everything. When we trust our own awareness, criticism does not destabilize us as easily. Praise does not inflate us as dramatically. We remain centered. Centered individuals contribute differently to the world. They do not react impulsively to collective fear. They do not amplify division through unconscious projection. In this way, emotional integration becomes a social responsibility. Consider how quickly collective emotion spreads. Anxiety in one person can ripple through a room. Anger can escalate within seconds, but coherence spreads as well. A calm nervous system can stabilize others. A grounded presence can de-escalate tension. When we do our inner work, we influence more than our private life. And yet the journey remains deeply personal, because even after significant healing, layers may still surface unexpectedly. An old memory triggered by a new circumstance. A subtle fear emerging during change. This does not mean we have failed, it means we are human. Growth is cyclical. Each cycle invites deeper refinement. What once felt overwhelming may now feel manageable. What once felt unconscious may now be recognized instantly. Progress is measured not by the absence of emotion, but by the speed and grace with which we return to balance. Returning to balance becomes intuitive. We learn the early signals of dysregulation. Tight shoulders, shallow breath, racing thoughts. Instead of ignoring them, we respond gently. A pause, a walk, a conscious breath, a reflective conversation. These simple acts prevent accumulation. Accumulation is what turns temporary emotion into chronic identity. When emotion moves freely, identity becomes fluid. We are not fixed in rigid self-definitions. We allow ourselves to evolve. Old labels lose relevance. We no longer introduce ourselves internally as the anxious one, or the angry one, or the wounded one. Those were chapters, not conclusions. This realization opens possibility. Possibility shifts belief, and belief, as we have explored, shapes biology and behavior. When we believe change is possible, neuroplasticity increases, motivation rises, the body aligns with intention. Hope, in this sense, is not naive optimism. It is biological activation toward growth. There is also a spiritual dimension to this transformation. Many wisdom traditions speak of purification of the heart as a prerequisite for deeper awareness. When emotional residue clears, intuition sharpens, insight deepens, connection to something greater than individual ego becomes more accessible. This does not require abandoning reason. It requires integrating reason with feeling. For too long, we have divided intellect and emotion as opposites. In reality, they are partners. Emotion provides energy. Intellect provides direction. When emotion is unresolved, intellect rationalizes distortion. When emotion is integrated, intellect serves clarity. Clarity guides action. Action aligned with clarity feels different from action driven by fear. It is less frantic, more deliberate, more sustainable. We no longer act to escape discomfort, we act to express alignment. Alignment reduces inner conflict. Inner conflict consumes extraordinary energy. When thoughts say one thing and emotions say another, the body remains tense. Once alignment is restored, when belief, emotion, and intention synchronize, effort decreases. Life flows with less friction. This flow does not eliminate responsibility, it enhances it. Because now we respond consciously to life rather than unconsciously repeating it. And perhaps one of the most liberating realizations is that unresolved emotion was never proof of weakness. It was evidence of sensitivity. Sensitivity, when unprocessed, becomes pain. When honored, it becomes empathy. Empathy strengthens connection. Connection nourishes resilience. Resilience supports growth, and growth expands consciousness. As consciousness expands, we begin to sense that emotional integration is part of a larger evolutionary movement within humanity, a shift from reactive survival to reflective awareness. Each person who heals contributes to that shift. Each moment of conscious response alters the trajectory of collective experience. This perspective reframes personal healing as participation in something greater. Yet even within this larger vision, the work remains intimate. It happens in quiet mornings when we sit with ourselves, in difficult conversations where we choose honesty over defense, in moments of disappointment where we choose curiosity over blame. Small choices accumulate just as unresolved emotions once did, but now the accumulation builds coherence instead of contraction. And as coherence strengthens, we may notice that life feels less like something happening to us and more like something unfolding through us, that our past no longer dictates our reactions, that our beliefs no longer imprison our biology, that our emotions no longer operate in shadow but move as integrated currents of intelligence, guiding us toward deeper authenticity. And in recognizing this, we begin to sense that the journey into the dark side of unresolved emotion was never about darkness at all, but about discovering the light of awareness that was waiting patiently beneath every unprocessed feeling, inviting us to continue exploring just how expansive human consciousness can become when nothing within us is left unseen.